thank you everyone for joining us today for this ISRF book launch, in which we're going to celebrate the recent publication of Dr. Jonathan Saha's very important book, Colonizing Animals, Interspecies Empire in Myanmar. My name is PostColonialism, as Stuart's already said, and I'm presiding over today's proceedings in the absence of the ISRF's Director of Research, Chris Newfield, who is hopefully at the tail end of a coronavirus infection and so can't make it today. In the spirit of Chris's way of chairing these launches, I would like to begin by situating today's launch in its context. We are living in what may very euphemistically be called extraordinary times. The pandemic that officials in Britain, from where I'm broadcasting today, are suggesting is over, is very much the opposite of over, of course, as is attested by our own absence today. And as if that weren't enough, we are also bearing witness to a war of aggression that is causing a tremendous amount of suffering and displacement. As many observers have pointed out, though, over the past few weeks, the hypervisibility of this ongoing war and the somewhat slanted coverage of it, certainly in Western European legacy media, risks eclipsing the fact that colonial and quasi-colonial wars have been a pervasive fixture of geopolitics in recent decades. Now, to make this observation is, of course, not to downplay the horrors that are being perpetrated in Ukraine as we speak, or to dabble in whataboutism, but it is to say that in order to understand the present moment, we need to bear in mind that colonial aggression has a long, long history. Now, this is the 14th book launch that the ISRF has organized, and anyone who looks back over the ISRF's catalogue of launches will notice that one theme that has united many of them is precisely the theme of colonialism or colonial history. Last year, for example, we launched Greg Jones's book, The War Lawyers, which deals with practices of juridical warfare by Israel and the United States. Catherine Charrett's book on the EU, Hamas, and the 2006 Palestinian elections, which speaks to Palestinian responses to Israeli violence. Dina Heath's book, Colonial Terror, a harrowing historical study of torture and police brutality in colonial India. Mike Mackin-Wade's book on Burnley Road, a key chapter of which traces the intimate ways in which Britain's industrial history is interwoven with its colonial history, and Ilan Ruhr-Wall's Law and Disorder, which carefully traces and theorizes the colonial history of British policing. This year, the ISRF book launches have picked up this thread. Our first launch of the year, which took place last month and which was on Alex Stingel's book, Care, Power, Information, dealt with the coloniality of the university and explored avenues of its decolonization. So that very neatly brings us to today's launch of Jonathan's Colonizing Animals, which is a groundbreaking study in colonial history. Yet even to call it that, a study in colonial or imperial history, is to risk underselling this important book. As myself, an aspiring historian of imperialism and a political theorist by training, one of the aspects of this book that left a deep impression on me is its uncanny ability to bring fine-grained historical analysis together with sharp conceptual analysis and genuine theoretical innovation. For example, in the first substantive chapter of the book, Jonathan thinks through what he calls undead capital, a concept that emerges from a conversation that he stages between Karl Marx, Donna Haraway, and Nicole Shukin. In subsequent chapters, he uses this concept to theorize the place that captured elephants and plough cattle, particularly oxen, had in the colonial division of labor in 19th century Myanmar, before very strikingly contrasting this to the treatment of animals that could not be wrangled into the colonial system and that were instead seen as a danger to it, such as crocodiles, whose carcasses he theorizes as simply dead capital. In bringing history and theory together in this way, Jonathan doesn't just use the historian's tools to great effect, but he also sharpens those tools as he proceeds, before turning around and putting those tools to work on the very practice of historiography itself, forcing it to reckon with its own blind spots that have resulted from stubborn anthropocentrism and residual instrumental rationality. It's impossible to read this book and not find your own assumptions about historical study, or for that matter, your reading of Karl Marx, profoundly changed. So for today's proceedings, we're going to start with Jonathan's overview of his book, which will run for about 10 to 15 minutes, after which we'll proceed with our panelists, Dr. Nikola Ludovice, coming to us all the way from Hong Kong, and Hiral Chhabra, calling in from Delhi. Jonathan may want to reply to their comments, and then we're going to open it up for questions. And I'll be introducing each of our speakers before they speak. So to start with today's author, Dr. Jonathan Saha is an associate professor in South Asian history at Durham University. He studied at the University of Sheffield and at the School of Oriental and African Studies, which is also where he obtained his PhD. Jonathan's research focuses on 19th and 20th century imperial history in Myanmar or Burma. His first book was entitled Law, Disorder, and the Colonial State, which was published in 2013. And he has since published on various aspects of the colonial system in Burma, including corruption, human-animal relations, and colonial medicine. Jonathan is a member of the editorial collective of the Fabulous History Workshop Journal, and he is also the co-chair of the Royal Historical Society's Race, Equality, and Ethnicity Working Group. Jonathan was an ISRF mid-career fellow between 2019 and 2020, where he completed a project called Accumulation and Empire. On the back of this project, he wrote a very thought-provoking piece for an issue of the ISRF's in-house bulletin a little over 2 years ago, and also has a journal article on this very same topic coming out very soon in the Journal of Empire and Commonwealth History. So I would advise you to keep an eye out for that. Much like his book on colonizing animals, this project on accumulation brought together history and theory in a profoundly innovative way, making each speak to the other critically but thoughtfully, and very much to the betterment of both. Jonathan's project has always seemed to me an exemplary case of the kind of research that the ISRF tries to promote: conceptually rigorous, historically grounded, and genuinely interdisciplinary. Jonathan, it really is a great pleasure, a great privilege and a pleasure to have you with us today. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Lars. That was a really generous introduction and pretty comprehensive as well. So I'll try and find some things to add to it. It was nice to see a physical copy of the book, which I'm also holding myself. It's a strange thing to publish in this day and age and not have that materiality around, but having it there has helped anchor me a little bit to realize that it's actually happened. I want to thank the ISRF for not only their funded support and the research which I did on accumulation really did reshape a lot of the animal project, but also for hosting this event today, which I'm very grateful for. I should also thank the Arts and Humanities Research Council, who provided funding for this project way back in the early days of it being developed in my mind, which was back in 2014. So this has been a long old project in the coming. And it came about really through my increasing recognition from the work that I've been doing in the archive of the ubiquity of animals in colonial history, but also in the documents and the records and the material artifacts produced by imperialism. And that ubiquity really sat ill with my own research and the research which I was reading, in which the natural world was peripheral to the writing of imperial history. And so some of the examples which I found looking at the early colonization of Myanmar, whether in the First Anglo-Burmese War of the 1820s or through to the more well-documented histories of the final annexation of what was remained of independent Myanmar under the Kongbao dynasty from 1885. In those battles, elephants in particular, but all host of other species, including mosquitoes, had a pivotal role in the outcomes of what occurred there. And you can see that all the way through to the end of British imperialism in Myanmar, whether it was in the Japanese occupation of 1942, in which British retreating civilians and officials noted the re-emergence of a variety of species on the streets of Yangon, including a black panther that was said to be stalking the abandoned houses there, and an orangutan that took up residence and attacked any passing by soldiers. But also in more ideological and cultural ways. The anti-colonial nationalist movement in Myanmar rallied around the symbol of the peacock as a fundamental part of their symbolism. And so in the process of engaging with all these different appearances of animals in the archive, what started off as feeling, even to myself, something of an esoteric subject, emerged as something which was much more foundational to understanding colonialism and its impacts in Myanmar, but also much more widely. Now, for the history of Myanmar itself, this engagement with the history of animals seems to unpick something of a division that had emerged in what historians were saying about the colonial history of that particular part of the world. And there was a growing division. From around 2010, there's been a real flourishing of research on Myanmar that coincided with what has proven to be a relatively brief period of opening up of civil society and, to a lesser extent, political expression. And that new research largely fell into two areas. A large number of historians were starting to reevaluate some of the social and economic history of the country, thinking about the legacies of imperialism on the agrarian roots of Myanmar's development, but also looking at various forms of extractive industries that emerged in the country. And then a lot of research was going on as well into changing political, cultural norms, particularly around the role of Buddhism in Burmese society and the emergence of tensions within, communal tensions within Myanmar. The history of animals straddled this divide, whether it was working oxen who were essential to the rice boom in Myanmar that made it the largest rice producing region in the world by the early 20th century, or the place of oxen within the political demands and concerns of Burmese nationalists, demands and concerns that ended up tessellating with concerns over Indian migration into the country. The other area of history, really sort of more of a greater geographical scope and of importance, was the sort of meeting point between animal history and imperial history. And reading along these two things, I became increasingly aware of the anthropocentrism of imperial history, something which had been written about by quite a few animal historians of empire. But over the course of writing the book, I became more concerned by a particular blind spot within animal histories of empire, which was the absence or large absence of acknowledging subaltern human relationships with non-human creatures. And it appeared to me that this absence or large absence was a result of sometimes an attempt to try and recover these voices as if they were the same types of silences in the record. One of the things I try and do in the book is to offer a way of thinking about those silences as being related to one another, but requiring careful acknowledgement of the particular types of voices that might be being overlooked here. So, for instance, animals are often silent in colonial records, not because of an attempt to keep their voices out or to marginalize those, but because of quite profound differences between humans and creatures. Where they appear in records, it is often the case that the colonial state or other actors whose voices are recorded were trying to bridge an experiential gap between themselves and the animals that they were trying to control in order to try and render elephants, for instance, docile bodies that could be used in the timber industry. Colonial states produced a lot of records on how to manage them, how to understand them, how to make them useful creatures. So the silence of the elephant is there, but the records are trying to overcome that silence in a variety of ways. For a lot of subalternized human actors, there is an attempt to other them, to create a greater difference between the imperial actor and the colonized subject. And as a result of those differences, you can, I think, be more attuned to why certain creatures' voices and certain humans' voices appear and where they don't. And my way of navigating that is through what I call Interspecies Empire, which is to try and keep in mind or keep central to our analysis the relationship between subalternized humans and the animals in which they interacted with which they interacted. Even as I was writing this and engaging with these types of ideas, though, I was aware that the book was quickly being superseded or being made out of date by emerging research in this field that did precisely that. Work that was attuned to the ways in which animals were understood by within colonial societies, by colonized peoples, by subaltern groups, and keeping those relationships central to their analysis in such a way as not to marginalize either the agency of animals or the agency of subaltern humans. And I'm very, very pleased to have two of those people here today to comment on my book. Nikola Ludovice, who has written a wonderful thesis on the history of animals in the colonial Philippines that is especially attuned to Tagalog language representations of creatures, and Hiral Chabra, whose work on particularly the legal structures around animals in colonial India can center the relationship between animals and their handlers in the colonial state's attempts to mobilize animal labor. So I'm thrilled to have them here. I'm really excited to hear about what their responses to the book are. And I really hope that people are able to pick up the work which they're doing and follow their research, which will be coming out over the coming years. And I think is going to be really defining for the field. So that's all I want to say. And I'm quite excited to hear what's going to come next. And thank you everybody for turning up today as well. I should have said that at the start.
Great, thank you very much, Jonathan. That was a very interesting introduction to your book and the sort of contextualization of how it came about. You've already done some of the work of introducing our two speakers. I'll still do some of that work. And we're going to start with Dr. Nikola Ludovice, who is a lecturer in the Department of History at the University of Hong Kong, where he teaches Philippine history, historiography, and the relation between food and empire, amongst other things. He obtained his PhD at that same university just last year in 2021, which I think is brilliant under any circumstance, but is doubly impressive during the extraordinary times that we are living through. His dissertation, which Jonathan already briefly mentioned, was entitled Domesticated Geographies, Animals and the Making of Modern Health in the Philippines, 1860 to 1935, and was examined by none other than Jonathan Saha. Nikola has published many interesting papers in an impressively wide number of areas, and one of his most recent papers is entitled COVID-19 as a Zoonotic Moment, placing the animal at the forefront of the history of pandemics. And in this paper, he seeks to overturn the way that we conceptualize the place of animals in pandemics. And in doing so, the paper brings history and theory together in a way that reminded me of the book that we're launching today. So I would warmly recommend it to everybody who's present. Nikola, thank you very much for joining us today so late in Hong Kong. And over to you.
Thank you so much. First and foremost, I would like to express my deepest gratitude to Dr. Jonathan Saha for inviting me to respond to his new work, Colonizing Animals. Thank you also for the ISRF team for organizing this event. This is a wonderful addition to an already growing field on animal histories, especially in Asia. I have been following Jonathan's work for many years, and I first encountered his works on animal histories when I was still doing my MA in the Philippines. Like many postgraduate students, I was still struggling on what to do with my thesis. and I stumbled upon his blog, also entitled Colonizing Animals. So whether by chance or by providence, his musings on the histories of animals piqued my interest. His questions had become my questions. How can animals have a history? How can animals be represented adequately in history? How can we examine animals beyond their object value? One reason why Jonathan's works had made such an impression on me was because these animal histories were not simply musings. There is an institutional pressure, especially in the discipline of history, to work on something new, something obscure, in the hopes of generating novel and innovative knowledge. At times, this pressure of having to write about animals just because they are novel end up just that, a novelty. This in turn creates two major problems. First, animals are not to be taken seriously as a historical subject. Second, it reaffirms the subjugated status of animals in historiography. Jonathan's book seeks to redress this by putting forward the idea of interspecies empire at the heart of the discussion. The term interspecies is in recent currency as a result of post-colonial and post-humanist discourse that shifts away from the traditional centers of imperial and anthropocentric power. It presupposes that humans, animals, and other living things interact over conditions of shared life. It signifies also how, in the operation of the empires, animals were constitutive. It also meant how non-human animals were subject to the transformation of colonial and imperial power. Rafi Yuwat in 2020 explains that to suggest that an organization or system is interspecies, it is to look into the practices that take place on site. He argues, quote, if states are generated by practices and those practices are not just human, but interspecies practices, including humans, animals, plants, trees, bacteria, insects, and others, then in many we have misunderstood what sovereign states are, end quote. Following his thought, if empires are to be considered as an accumulation of interspecies practices, then we are also looking into the ecological process that makes the empire. Not just perhaps in the sense of resource extraction or consumption, but in the interspecies generation of meanings that form and constrain political life. This entailed being aware of the diverse and complex histories of Southeast Asia. Many of the animal histories set in Europe were assumed to have been an extension to the Asian context, a diffusion, if you will. Perhaps because of the overtly Eurocentric narrative that European ideas about ideas would spill over to the rest of the world, or with the thought that perhaps animals reacted and operated in a way, and thus the Western observations about animals might all be the same elsewhere. The issue humans confront in are also concerns in which animals play a deeper and a central role. Jonathan's work is also instructive to my work. In my thesis, I explored the place and role of animals in the development of modern health in the Philippines under late Spanish and American colonial rule from approximately 1860 to 1935, in which I investigate the creation of modern animal sites such as laboratories, slaughterhouses, ice plants, domestic houses. These sites are constitutive of novel disciplinary regimes that call forth manifold techniques of surveillance. While these animal geographies reflected developing scientific knowledge, they also help produce new knowledge, architectures, technologies, relations, and regulations. The animal sites I consider are produced by violent and coercive reorderings and governed through asymmetric power relations. His concept of the undead capital is inspired and has a strong resonance in animals involved in health. As sentient creatures, animals produce new knowledges which are valuable in understanding the processes of human and environmental health. Through vivisection, dissection, or animal experimentation, comparative anatomy and bacteriological sciences in the 19th century had demonstrated that instead of differences, there were significant similarities which challenged the supposed human and animal borders. At the same time, animals were among to be the first to be suspected when epidemic outbreaks occurred. Public health strategies like segregation, quarantine, culling were 19th century measures to ensure the protection of other undead capital. Much like Jonathan's discussion on gossiping rodents in the chapter on anti-colonial affinities, animals as vermin translated not only within the realm of animals, but extended to the treatment of socially marginalized peoples. In this manner, the making of modern health in the empire is an interspecies event. Jonathan's work belongs to the growing literature on interspecies politics and history that is foregrounded on the history. To use interspecies as a framework begs us to reconsider an epistemological and ethical response. First, in the form of continued radical decentering of humans through animal history. Animal history draws its strength from the constant refutation of historical stability of anthropocentric assumptions in what Jonathan calls as the politics of negation. Interspecies is not an assumption of the natural or ecological, but one whose nature is subject to historical contingency. As Jonathan emphasizes, quote, this centering of animals also allowed scholars to emphasize the value of animals in their own right, rather than solely in relation to humans, end quote. Interspecies relations and ecologies change with its context. Second, in the form of meaningful environmental action. I think this is something that even us, we are quite unclear in the objective and purpose of many animal historians. Sometimes it becomes a concern even for us who are working on particular animal issues, such as health, legal status, animal welfare, and the like. In the context of the Anthropocene, where the human serves as a powerful force in transforming its environment, an engagement with the proper stakeholders is not only proper, but urgent as well. From the onset, Jonathan's book extends the post-colonial and post-humanist discourses that places animals as radical subjects. This is quite significant, especially within the context of imperialism, in which animals seem not to have subjectivities, but only as being reduced to its biocultural form. But a closer reading would resound some of the postmodern concerns as well. In particular, I see how there is an uncanny resemblance of interspecies relations to the Delusion rhizome, where similar to a crabgrass, it grows horizontally by sending out runners to establish new plants, which in turn, sends out their own plants in the cracked and rough surfaces. Interspecies relations are similar in a way because it grows as part of an acentered assemblage. With the decentering of humans, every interspecies relationships becomes the center, and it is connected to other interspecies relationships, including its systems, structures, ideologies, knowledge systems, and even violence. Hence, I raise three questions from this work in relation to animals and health. First, where does it all begin and where does it all end? To adapt an interspecies frame is to acknowledge the multiplicities of power sources, despite the existence of a supposed central power. Empire and colonies, the colonizer and the colonized, cannot be thought anymore as binaries. The boundaries between humans and animals blur because they are also closely connected. We have seen it here in the pandemic, how zoonotic diseases have spilled over into human communities. Any disruptions into these connections affect everyone as well. Second, an interspecies framework does not immediately indicate unity of relations. In fact, it should be wary about any semblance of unity and totality, as all species participate differently, variedly in world making. How do animals participate in the collective activities in which inclusion, exclusion, violence, and flourishing are all at stake? Finally, the interspecies does not have a master plan, a blueprint, or a defining architecture, nor intends to have one, but reacts when in contact to those outside of the relations. In this day and age where relations between animals and humans are tested because of the emergence and re-emergence of diseases, what can such relations become of? What will the animal-human relations look like in Southeast Asia? And how will animal history branch out? Again, congratulations, Jonathan, for this stunning and timely book. I am truly, truly honored to be able to respond to your work. It's magnificent work. Thank you so much, and maraming salamat.
Thank you so much, Nikola, for those very thoughtful and thought-provoking comments. I thought that was great. Okay, moving on to our third speaker today. Hiral Chabra is currently a teaching fellow at Ashoka University, as well as a PhD candidate in history at the University of Delhi, where she's completing a doctoral project on human-animal relationships in colonial India. She's also been a recipient of a Global History Fellowship at the International Institute of Social History in Amsterdam. Hiral has published a number of papers that are very relevant to tonight's topic, including a book chapter from 2020 that's called Making Violent Killings Humane, State-Sponsored Elimination of Stray Dogs in Colonial India, which chimes very nicely with Jonathan's discussion of colonial governmentality, which is also passed through the figure of dogs. Another paper, this one from 2019, is called Animal Laborers and the Law in Colonial India, and it's referenced several times in Jonathan's book. In that paper, Hiral powerfully contests the erasure of animal labor from the broader domain of labor history. She does so by reading a series of laws from late 19th and early 20th century colonial India against the jurisprudential grain, if you like, exploring what they reveal about the role animals fulfilled in the colonial division of labor. And here again, the resonances with Jonathan's work couldn't be clearer. Hiral, thank you so much for joining us today. It's a real pleasure to have you on the panel, and over to you.
Thank you so very much. It is my pleasure, honor, and good luck, I must say, to have reviewed this book, to have read this book. I met Jonathan, we were together in a panel once, I think 5 years back, and the discussion started then. And one could not help but notice the similarities of concerns that animal historians have, over various domains and geographical locations. I will not repeat, because Nikola has done a brilliant job analyzing the book, so I'll not go there, but rather I'll limit my comments to 3 or 4 questions or suggestions, and let's see where we can then go ahead. First of all, I don't agree with Jonathan when he says that while he was writing the book was seemingly becoming outdated. I think this book will be one of the to-go books for most of us who are in the field, and for many of us who will join the field eventually. There are many reasons why this book has been very, very substantial in its approach, and also I'm sure in its impact. One of the reasons is the location of the book within the context of South Asia and Southeast Asia and the emerging debates therein. We know for a fact that animal turn or the animal questions in history or animal studies as a field has come to us from the West or the global North, or whatever you may put it as. But what that has done is that the conceptual understandings have also come along. Now, what happens when those frameworks are then put in a historical context, which are substantially different experientially, also in terms of resources, also in terms of application? Now, this book is a very, very good intervention at that point, because it gives us not only a different context, in this case, Myanmar, but also very strong vocabulary and analytical tools to go ahead with research. And this, I think, is one of the very, very central feature and a very central contribution that the book gives. Now, to pick up on the title, Colonizing Animals and Interspecies Relations that is talked about, I think that also destabilizes a lot. Okay, one of the central feature of the animal studies approach or the animal history approach has been the animal-human divide, right? We increasingly in South Asia are now questioning this terminology. And I think this book really goes ahead and provides us with a terminology which can then replace the divide with either a difference or a differentiation, as Jonathan clearly puts out in his book, but I think also in terms of relation. So the vocabulary of how humans and animals are envisioned within a different context becomes very clear. That's one. Second, think in terms of conceptual intervention that this book makes is at 2 levels. One, of course, it gives a newer terminology, something like subject, object, and abject. Which has been, I think, a very, very strong contribution of this book, because it helps us navigate across species, including humans. It also helps us navigate different relations, which are then not determined by the field that one is placed into. So even a legal historian can pick this up and look at the interventions that this typology can make. Second contribution conceptual that I think Jonathan has really done a brilliant job is to highlight the inadequacies that the existing frameworks have while we're analyzing. So something like how the concept of sovereignty and its link with the legality of mass killing, how that has not really been thought through if you bring in the animal question, right? So what then therefore the lagunas are, and then how can they be attended? I think that's another very, very strong conceptual intervention. There are two more concerns that I have, and while I was reading it and I was constantly thinking that can it be envisaged? One is, can a history like this be envisaged in a global history term, in terms of global history? And I say this because of 2-3 reasons. One is, Jonathan often says in his book that animals are transgressive. And it's a profound statement, that because they're transgressive in many ways, because of their ubiquity in the sources. So they are not confining themselves in their presence to a specific domain, hence transgressive. They're transgressive because they help us overcome our own human-centric notions in analysis, right? Second, they have the ability to destabilize the given, especially the conceptual given, right? If this is so, right, we then, therefore, through the colonial understanding of non-humans within South Asian context, maybe, can we then reconsider the relationships that are there between the colony and the metropole, which is a very simplistic understanding, but also between the colonies and between the metropoles? Because the knowledge system that are gained, and which Jonathan brings out beautifully in terms of the terminologies used, in terms of the technologies used for death, let's say the lethal chambers that are used, the way they're brought out and they're used and improved upon again and again. Also the borrowing of historical actors within this entire thing. Then can we, or do we need to reconsider the idea of colonial itself? Can colonial therefore be little more than not only a to and fro interaction, but interacting in multiple ways? And in that, where do we then stand? My second concern, which is a question which is asked of me often, and I don't know how to answer it, because a certain headway has been made with animal studies in the South Asian context, is that it also destabilizes the periodization of history, which is a very central theme, because that also unroots our understanding of where we place ourselves, right? So a very typical understanding of South Asian history into ancient, medieval, and modern, right? If animals are transgressive, and if animal-human relationships are also transgressive in that sense, and they're ubiquitous, right? If this is a given, how does it then have the potential to revisit the periodization, which has governed much of our understanding of history as a discipline? That's one. And the third is that I think Jonathan's book serves a very, what should I say, a selfish purpose, which is that everyone and anyone who picks up an animal history project is asked, of what is the purpose of doing it? Why are you doing that? What is the relevance of doing it? And I think this book captures that and answers that in a very, very strong way. With the world that we live in today, and historically, has been shaped by animal-human interaction in various capacities. And that has to be addressed. And that address has to take place in a very, very holistic manner. As historians, we can only look at our archives and formulate our opinions regarding that. And I think Jonathan has been extremely, extremely successful in doing that. And this book is going to be one of the leading books to have provided conceptual frameworks which have a long life, and also flexibility to adapt to different situations and to different geographical context. And I am sure that they can also be put in different periodization and then also analyzed accordingly. So thank you so very much, and it has been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you so much, Hiral. That was really great and very generous. Before we move on to the Q&A section, I would like to just return to Jonathan and invite him to share some thoughts or responses or replies or further questions in response to the panelists' very interesting contributions. And then after that, we're going to take some questions from the audience. But in order to have questions, I would ask audience members who want to ask any of them, or maybe share comments or thoughts with any of our three panelists, to put them in the Q&A box, maybe in the next couple of minutes, so that we can gather them and see how many there are before we start talking through them. Jonathan, over to you. Thank you,
Lars. So I'll say a couple of things, if only to give people a chance to gather their thoughts and put any questions in there. I can't respond to everything which Nikola and Hiral have said, but I will take a lot of that away and really think about it. And also, when I'm feeling low, I'll try and remember some of the positive things that people have said about me as well. So thank you for those. I think there's a point which kind of overlaps in what was said in Nicola's question of where does it all begin with an interspecies approach, and Hiral's question about how do we periodize this and how does animals change our periodization. I guess one of the ways I think that through in the book, or at least in the conclusion to the book, is through genealogies, and maybe specific genealogies of specific interspecies relationships. And one of those, let's take two of those very briefly. The use of elephants in human enterprises, but particularly in timber extraction, and the use of oxen and buffalo in agriculture. So elephant management techniques, elephant training have a long temporality, which we could trace back to the very early periods of Myanmar, as well as associated sort of cultural standing of the elephant. But a particular mode of capital accumulation resulted in the enlistment of around 10,000 working elephants in the early 20th century. So we have a particular periodization within a much longer and deeper history of Burmese peoples, and also Karen and Kachin peoples' training of elephants. And that leads to a particular set of arrangements today where a large number of working elephants are employed in Myanmar, and their future is precarious. Not only precarious because of attempts, a lot of which has been undermined over the last year, to reduce timber extraction in Myanmar, and also undermined because of the unsustainability of those logging activities. So what happens to the working elephants? They can't be returned to the wild in the form that they're in. And so tracing this genealogy enables us to think, well, what's valuable about a living elephant? What are the relationships around it that need to be altered and thought about to make a world in which elephants can thrive? And the world in which elephants can thrive is one in which poverty alleviation in the countryside in Myanmar is put front and center. And so it gives us a way of orientating ourselves politically with regard to elephants. Oxen, we have a different set of relationships going on. So in the colonial period, in the 1920s and 30s in particular, there were an emerging set of concerns about Indian populations, particularly Muslim populations, and their relationships with Burmese oxen. And that was partly about introducing what was perceived to be weaker Indian oxen into the stock of Burmese oxen. But it also mapped onto more overtly racist and religiously chauvinistic political ideas. And we can see those retain as a theme in post-colonial Burmese history right through into the 2010s, in which a movement of cow protection emerged that was very much an attack on Muslim populations in Myanmar. And so our political orientation of tracing this nationalist genealogy in the place of animals within Burmese nationalism, I think helps us as radical historians or other interested parties orientate ourselves in relation between the desire to produce worlds in which animals can thrive, but not setting that against communally divisive politics. So that periodization, that question of where do things begin, if we locate them in specific relationships, we have specific histories that give us a position from which we can orientate ourselves in the present. So I picked up on that point because that's where I end the book, but it's also hopefully a useful point to launch some discussions. But thank you again for your really wonderful interventions. I really appreciate them.
Great, thank you, Jonathan. I see that we've just had a question that I've not been able to read through yet. So I'm going to do that. And in the meantime, I'm going to leave the three of you with a question that I've had reading this book. It's one of those books that, for me, brings a crucial intervention forward that, once you've read it, seems obvious. Yes, the world is interspecies. Yes, my life is completely interwoven with the life of animals. But the seeming obviousness is sort of a lie, because it's a form of making me rethink pretty much everything that I thought I knew about the world. So it's one of those interventions that seems obvious, but actually makes you rethink. There seems to be a very radical series of implications here in thinking about animals differently. And I think this is true for all three of your work. So what I would just leave you with is the question, and I know that all three of you have already touched upon it in your presentations, but what do you think the implications are politically, historiographically, philosophically, of maybe not centering animal life, but certainly contesting the erasure of animal life in the way in which we approach labor history, legal history, the history of capitalism, etc. So yeah, that's the question that I came away thinking reading this book.
So I might start off there. I think some of what you're pointing out there is pertains to what I was saying just before about how does it orientate ourselves, and how does it help orientate ourselves in the present in relation to pressing political issues. I think on a sort of more abstract level, thinking about animal erasure in what we've done and what it means to bring that back in, I think is not just sort of correcting the record as much as it is also offering different ways in imagining the past, and also the ways in that past might have played out differently. It gives us a way of thinking through our current moments, our current times, and changing the stakes of what a particular event might mean, expanding the stakes, expanding the realm of what's involved in any particular event, and through that potentially expanding what we might include in the ethical and political judgments that we make in those moments.
Nikola or Harald, did you want to comment on that as well?
I think it also, at least in my work with health, it not only discusses the political or economic aspects of health, but it tries to reshift the focus on health as truly interspecies. That, if we don't look into the health of animals or plant life, then our own health would be affected as well. And so ontological shifting of what health is or what health entails, it also becomes not only a conceptually innovative strategy, but something that is quite urgent, as we have seen in the scientific experiments. It also looks into the discipline of history itself, as it can no longer ignore scientific inquiries like from the sciences, or from medical, or from environmental sciences in that sense. So it also has that implication for rethinking about other dimensions, especially that are very pressing nowadays.
If I were to put it, it leads to revision, reorientation, and also highlighting the interlinks. If these are the three things, and I think for us as academics and researchers who are doing the field, and for others also, I think one of the strongest lead it has is it provides us with an opportunity to revise our epistemic constructs, and that happens across disciplines. And once that possibility opens up, I think what a person of each discipline does with it, it's up to that person. But substantially, it opens up the possibility to explore uncharted domain. I think that's one of the central contributions. People play with it becomes, their own endeavors. But I think that is one of the central things.
Yeah, thank you very much. We've got two very interesting questions. I'm just going to take these each in turn because there's already a lot to discuss here. The first question is from Efrat Gilad, and they say, thank you for all speakers. My name is Efrat Gilad. I actually published a short piece with the History Workshop blog on my work on meat in Palestine. My question is, when you find primary sources about animals in the archives, describing their workability, needs, the provisions they can provide, etc., how do you read these sources against the archival grain? As in, how do you see the animal itself and its agency beyond what the human writes about it? So I think this is a question for all three of you.
If I can start with that one, if that's all right, because it really gets to the heart of, I think, of the methodological precision that we require when we're looking at interspecies relationships. So the notion of reading the archive against the grain, if we're going to take maybe one of the most important interventions in that approach, Ranajit Guha, starts on the premise that colonial archives are encoded with particular ways of understanding subaltern, in his case, peasant human actions that are trying to be sort of guarded against and controlled in some form. And that works for humans as they are captured in an archive. I'm not sure it works actually for when we're dealing with all animals in an archive and how their worlds are going to be rendered. Certainly to an extent, animals are coded within a set of discourses, as most phenomenon actors are. But the approach of Guha in reading that against the grain is based on a certain level of universalism that humans have a shared experiential world. And we can't go into understanding animals in the archive and how their actions are being encoded with that same understanding. Animals have substantially, radically different experiential worlds, some species more than others, but nonetheless that's the case. And so I think we also need to be open to engaging with, as Nikola was suggesting earlier, contemporary scientific writings, treating those critically, but also thinking how we might be able to engage those in the past, thinking about co-evolutionary shared areas, but most importantly, distinguishing between agency and subjective experience. And creatures may have very little agency in certain circumstances, but they will still have subjective experiences of those, which we might want to uncover through those creative modes that I've outlined there. Or they may have quite clear agency in certain archives and certain records, but it might be very difficult to get to what their subjective experiences are in those moments. Some species, it might be easier to pick out their agency, the historical effect that they have, so to speak, rather than their experiences of things, because their experiences are so alien to us as humans. And so I think those two things, being aware of the difference in experiential worlds, which means we can't just map on the methods which we would apply to humans, to animals, but also being aware of that difference between agency and subjective experience, or at least disentangling those, so that we can be sensitive to specific species and their place in history. So it's a great question. I hope my answer isn't sort of evasive in its sort of horses for courses, to use an idiom, approach to it. But I think hopefully that gets us somewhere to an answer for that.
Hiral, would you like to speak to this as well? You've done a lot of reading against the grain.
Incidentally, this is what I'm working on right now. So there's a three-pronged approach here, which I usually take, and I base my analysis on the official colonial sources of British India. One, revisit the idea of agency in itself in order to facilitate entry of non-humans. Amanda Rees has done a brilliant work with a special issue of one of the journals where the inadequacy of how we understand agency currently and how it's human-centric needs to be revisited. So one, flip the idea to make space for non-humans. That's one. Second, animals are there in practically all departments. They're essentially there. And it is what questions we ask of their presence that actually will help us lead against the grain. So for instance, if animals are taken as property, which is a central status that they hold, right? Is that a consistent pattern? Once you ask a question like this, you'll realize it's not. And if it's not, then how do we then envisage? And that is where you make your intervention. So I think it's a three-pronged approach. One, revisit the conceptual frameworks that you already have in order to facilitate animal entry. Second, revisit the archives, locate the presence, which, as Jonathan says, has been overlooked. So it's not the absence that we have to make. It's not the silences that are there within the archives. No, it's very much the presence. But why the absence, therefore? Right. So you ask questions differently and then let yourself explore, because each archive will then throw up a different idea to you.
Nikola, did you want to comment on this as well?
Just perhaps just an addition. It has already been added. It's also to look into the into animals in the archive and the purposes of these different archives altogether would actually make a difference because of the way we repurpose the archives altogether. A lot of the archives are really meant for humans. It really is a repository for human events and human collections, and so animals would play as a as a side actor in all of these things. But to go against the grain is to be aware also of the purpose of the archive itself, and to look into the traces in which they are there. It's just that we have to read through the documents in a way that where can they possibly be? And so they don't just exist, for example, in an undead state. For example, in a whole form, they can be deconstructed, pieced apart. Okay, in the manner of, for example, when you look into meats and slaughterhouses or milk and dairy farms. So how are they? How are they taken apart, and how are they taken together in the same archive that we are investigating?
Great, thank you. We've got a very interesting question from Rinku Ada for Jonathan. They say, thank you all for a fascinating discussion, and this is for Jonathan. Did the notion of sacred figure in colonial engagement with animals that you found? And if so, how was that notion negotiated?
Yeah, it's a great question. Sort of the sacred status less so, but religiosity is really important. And here I'm building more on a lot of work on the emergence of Burmese anti-colonial thought in general, not just nationalism, that anchors that in the Theravada Buddhist desire to preserve the teachings of the Buddha and the concern that the teachings of the Buddha are disappearing, in particularly in the colonial moment. And that inspires in part a reformist attitude to Buddhism, and attempts from activist monks, civil society organizations, as well as political nationalists, to get lay Buddhist people in Myanmar to alter their relationships with animals, to be vegetarian, to abstain from eating meat, to behave in a more humane way towards animals. And that, in its edges, blurs into more antagonistic views of other relations with other religions. So religiosity is really central to a lot of this, but more in that Buddhist conception of preserving the sanasa, the teachings of the Buddha.
Great, thank you, Jonathan. We've got a question from Andrew Robertson, which goes, I recently read James Rebank's memoir of upland sheep farming in the UK, which effectively says, if you think we shepherds have subalternized status, then you're mistaken. So it plays on the idea of commoners, users of commons, legally defined as a dignified or sort of classed status. It's deeply interspecies in outlook. And they say, I wonder if panelists have read it and whether it's a useful reference point in regards to stewardship that sees itself as having escaped colonization. Also, one of his clearest binaries is between working animals on the one hand and pets on the other. Any thoughts about that one?
So I haven't read it, but it does sound fascinating. It does sound like a really useful reference point, particularly regarding stewardship. It may not be fully analogous, but it does make me think about the continuing use of elephants, not so much in the timber industry in Myanmar, but as a form of subversive logistics, particularly for ethnic minority groups in the borderland areas, where the relationships between Uzis, elephant drivers, who are ethnic minority groups, Kachin in particular, and their elephants, is framed differently. And some theorists have starting to think through that more as a sort of lasting, potentially sort of post-Anthropocene way of being with these large giant mammals. And so a sense of stewardship, I think, does feature within that. But I'll certainly be picking up that reference and following up for it. Thank you.
Nikola or Hirao, did you have anything to say in response to this question?
I haven't encountered the work, but I will actually take note of this one as James Rebank's memoir of upland sheep farming. That should be interesting.
Okay, let's move on to the next question, which is from Chris Pearson. This is a very broad and intriguing one, and it's for all three of you. Many thanks to all the speakers and congratulations on a fantastic book, Jonathan. I'd be interested in what the panelists think about the relationships between animals and environments in colonial settings. What role have animals played in reshaping or maintaining environments? Over to you.
Yeah, they've a huge role. And I think one of the interesting things about looking like, it's a great question. Thank you, Chris, I should say at the start. One of the interesting things about looking at a colony like Myanmar, which is not a settler colony, which does not experience the same profound ecological changes that we're used to seeing in settler colonies like Australia or the Americas, is that you still see animals implicated and imbricated in large-scale environmental changes, whether it's elephants involved in the extraction and destruction of their own natural habitats, or oxen involved in transforming large mangroved delta into a area of almost continuous rice paddy fields. Where I want to push that a bit further is the argument that focusing on animals themselves and the politics, the radical politics of animal history, is that valuing animals as actors is also valuing the ecologies that keep them alive. And so if we are trying to make a space for animals as actors in the past, we also should be attuned to the necessary ecological arrangements, food systems, companion species that accompany them, that are necessary for their flourishing and perpetuation as a species. And that means, I think, that animal history can refine perhaps some of its radical agenda by acknowledging that, and that what we're trying to do is keep these species in our worlds, in our imaginations, because they connote far more than those individual species. They connote a whole world of interspecies, interactions with plants, humans, and all of us that are also dependent on the perpetuation and the survival of those species.
Great. Hiral, did you have any thoughts in response to this question?
This is a very broad question, and I think each species and each animal-human relationship would have a different story to tell, basically. But if I were to answer this and pick up one commonly encountered animal within our lives in India, at least, the street dogs, I would say that the colonial experience, throughout the colonial experience, despite the wave being against them, they've been able to manage to have a stake within the social environment because of their inherent relationships with the human communities standing by them or in the vicinity. This is to say that they have responded to the colonial pressures, which is mass killing, right? And how have they then responded is by forging those connections with the human groups, being part of the ecosystem and the social setup, that even till now, almost 60, 70 years down the lane from where we had mass killing, the dogs are still a reality and they're likely to stay because they're ingrained within. So if I were to flip the question a bit, I would just say that every species has made an attempt to respond to the colonial pressures that have been, what bestow is a wrong word, but which has been put on them, forced on them by negotiating the realities that they have and making a space for themselves. So I think that way I would turn the question around and I would say, if there is persistence of any species for that matter, why? And if we look at it that way, I think then a different idea of interaction between colonialism and environment, whether it's maintained, changed, or reconfigured, that can be put through.
Great, thank you. Nikola?
It figures quite, actually the question is so broad that, you know, it impinges on everyone, especially when it comes to health. I mean, health and environment is like very symbiotic in that sense, in that, you know, but to put in the equation, into the equation, colonialism is also to suggest a particular economy that is being promoted in the colony, and that would be, you know, a lot of extraction of resources, as well as the creation of a new the built environment, and the emergence of plantations. And so with, you know, with the expansion of a lot of the new settlements, okay, in order to build new plantations, new pastures, it also meant that you have to expand and to cut down forests, okay, and you have forests as actually reservoirs of diseases in a lot of sectors. And so with these as being expanded, you have your wild animals now transferring into the city, transferring into towns, becoming, you know, not even citizens of these towns, but either denizens or feral or even stray dogs, for that manner. And that's in that manner you have you have a more liminal quality that goes between, dogs that reside in streets, dogs that reside at home, and the treatment between them. And so disease making is part and parcel about the interaction between health and the environment, and the anthropocentric and the anthropogenic activities that come with it. And so we do not have a lot of records of spillovers, at least in the colonial documents, because of, a lot of these are very localized or very centralized. But we tend to feel the effects of a lot of these spillovers when they already reach into built environments, into urban places or cities. And so we are able to question in that sense how these transformations and changes in the environment actually affect the mobilities of animals in urban centers, how they interact in such built environments, and what allows them to be displaced or uprooted at the same time. I think the most evident example there would be when during the anthropos, during the pandemic, we saw that lockdowns have forced people inside their own homes, and we saw how deer and cattle, wolves, tigers, they just roam the streets all over the world, and we saw that because of the liminality of a lot of these spaces, as well as the overlaps between what is built, what is natural environments. And we can see how much we have expanded, and us as transgressing their own ways. We can talk more about health and environment, but I think it just scratches the surface when it comes to that.
That was great. Thank you so much. We've reached the end of our runtime today, so we're going to close. But in closing, I would just like to ask each of you, or three of you, to just sort of maybe share some parting thoughts with us. Some final conclusions, some final ideas, some final comments. Hiral, can we start with you?
You're going by ladies first. Okay, no, I think conversations like these need to be encouraged. Also because this field is just gaining strength in South Asian context. But what comes out of this, it has a global impact. Also because talking of animals, I think, has a dual purpose. One is academic for sure, it broadens our research horizon, but somewhere down the line, it also has an impact on our own understanding and the way we act, and hopefully in policy decision making, if that reaches that level. So I think these conversations are extremely helpful, and I think we should carry on like this. Yeah.
Agreed. Nikola?
Actually, almost the same with Hiral, but I'd also add that conversations like these also allow for Asia not as a laboratory for a lot of the Western theories. Rather, it is a unique, it's unique on its own. It has its own, it has its own context. It has its own diversity. It has its own story, and so how animals are connected to our daily lives. It's almost as if they're there, but actually they're not there, because we are not including them into the conversation, or we are not conscious enough to include them into the conversation. And so when we try to keep on the discussion about animals, we are not just putting them forward into history, into the center stage of history. We are also putting them into this entire discourse that we have to keep them and make them as urgent as a concern, as subjects as possible. So thank you so much.
Right. Jonathan, final word is yours.
Okay, so I think there's two things I would want to emphasize. One is sort of historiographic, which backs onto what something Nikola said at the start about this desire for the novelty. And I guess against that, a need to dwell on some of these subjects and to really think about this and how it might reshape our tools and our field in a thoroughgoing way and not race to the next thing. And then the second is the importance of really rooting yourself in a particularity and not moving to a generalization or abstraction before, or where actually, you know, there are important things happening in Myanmar. It's important in its own terms. What's happening there can tell us about other places, but not to lose sight of the particularities of place, of time, and the implications of those for today.
Great, thank you so much. Jonathan, Hiral, Nikola, you've been really brilliant. It's been an absolute privilege to host the three of you in this great panel. That's it for today. Thank you so much for attending, everyone. And we hope to see you at the next ISRF book launch.